In this pod-slice summary of the Jordan Peterson podcast, esteemed author, journalist, and commentator Glenn Greenwald and host Dr. Jordan Peterson delve into the widening chasm between the views of the elite class and popular opinion, focusing specifically on issues like gender ideology and the power of multinational corporations. They discuss how government response to popular dissent generally veers between appeasement or suppression. The conversation then segues into Greenwald's political views and stance. Rachel Maddow had once dubbed Greenwald as the most fearless political commentator on the American left. Despite this, Greenwald reveals that he has consistently upheld individual liberties and values, staying critical of policies that threaten them, regardless of political affiliation. Greenwald points out that his views haven't changed over time. Rather, societal and political perspectives have, redefining his stances as right-wing. Through the years, Greenwald has been particularly critical of the curtailing of civil liberties after 9/11 under the guise of national security. He expresses alarm at the reluctance of Americans to label this as a breach of personal freedom. The host and guest then delve into Greenwald's career trajectory, revealing how he left a lucrative position at a Wall Street law firm to start a First Amendment litigation law firm. Greenwald highlights his childhood influences, particularly instances where the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, defended even the most egregious expressions of free speech as inspiration for his career choice. Greenwald sheds light on his iconoclastic stance, wherein he fearlessly represented controversial clients, including a leader of the neo-Nazi movement who wanted to practice law. He believed that profession should not be barred from individuals based on political ideology. The conversation then highlights the threat to freedom of speech in professional settings. Peterson notes that various professional colleges in Canada have restricted individuals' rights to speak freely, often under the guise of character fitness for practicing the profession. Greenwald concurs, noting similar instances in the U.S. and other Western societies where even financial service industries exclude people on ideological grounds, pushing society towards dangerous levels of conformity. The two further debate the value of free speech, contending that the right to critique, dissent, and challenge is something that all should defend. They point out that censorship doesn't solely affect minority voices, but also majoritarian views, including those deemed politically incorrect. Greenwald underscores that the biggest casualty of this overarching censorship is critical thinking and the potential for human development. The discussion concludes with a segment on hate speech and the dangers of categorizing unpalatable views under this all-encompassing term. The dialogue further extends towards the dangers of suppressing fringe ideologies, with both Peterson and Greenwald warning against pushing them underground and creating martyrs, which counterintuitively elevates their impact and appeal. They both advocate for public conversation and social scorn instead of censorship as more effective means to marginalize nefarious ideas. A key point discussed is how censorship often commences with a universally despised figure, making the act seem acceptable. However, Greenwald warns that this quickly extends to a broader scale, leading to the suppression of mainstream voices. He illustrates this with examples of Google's censorship of Robert Kennedy Jr. and Senator Rand Paul's interviews, instances where voices from the American mainstream were abruptly silenced. The mounting pressure against free speech, according to Greenwald, stems from generational cultural shifts and the perceived danger presented by unacceptable ideologies. He argues that millennials and Gen Z prioritize other values over free speech, a trend that he observes has increased alarmingly. Adding fuel to the fire, Greenwald identifies the election of Donald Trump as a crucial accelerant. Trump's portrayal as a menace to democratic values greenlit various forms of suppression in the name of defending democracy. This manufactured perception of an apocalyptic battle against evil enables a range of drastic measures to seem justified, abandoning the fundamentals of journalism, infringing on free speech, and disregarding due process. The conversation provides a striking example of this, where Sam Harris justifies media deception over Hunter Biden's laptop scenario as being an acceptable sacrifice to prevent Trump from coming to power. This contorted logic is growing amongst the elite class, Greenwald believes, pushing society towards a dystopian ethos where ends justify any means. He questions whether these processes are a cascade of clamps initiated after the 9/11 attacks. Peterson and Greenwald delve deeply into the consequences of suppressing civil liberties in many realms of society. Peterson uses the potent symbol of airports as micro-fascist states where, post 9/11, the stringent security measures meant that everyone was treated as a potential threat, thereby conditioning people to adopt this mindset elsewhere as well. Greenwald concurs with Peterson's link between current censorship trends and post 9/11 clampdowns. Drawing from his personal experiences, Greenwald recalls the fear and trauma of the event and how it led to a willingness to support measures that people might otherwise resist. He alludes to how these responses created an authoritarian mentality and conditioned Americans to accept infringements on their autonomy, highlighting this pattern in conservatives' reactions. The conversation also covers the subtle threats to liberty with an emphasis on how fear is often utilized to justify impinging on civil liberties. Peterson asserts that any purported emergency is not a sufficient justification to infringe upon free speech, tying the ability to speak freely to the ability to think freely. Orwell's concept of effective despotism is discussed, with Greenwald outlining Orwell's notion that real tyranny lies not in force, but in manipulation and control of thought through a meticulously managed flow of information. Seemingly, the freedom offered by the internet turned out to be an illusion, as surveillance technologies have made it possible for states to monitor and control information flow on an unprecedented scale. Greenwald feels this regime makes dissent virtually impossible, effectively controlling society. He also touches on the phenomenon of propaganda, noting how this form of psychological warfare is designed to cater to psychological needs, while creating a reward and punishment system that thrives on manipulating the population. This manipulated flow of information serves the interest of a small elite, thus subtly eliminating dissent. The discussion ultimately centers on the societal implications caused by censorships and restrictions in civil liberties, revealing a distressing picture of a future where freedom of thought and expression could become alarmingly constrained. In this segment of the podcast, Peterson delves into the distinction between the religious and political realm. He refers to the religious language as a conduit of discussing malevolence beyond the political aspect. Peterson presents a theory that with the collapse of religious belief systems, elements of good and evil, often attributed to divinity, start to play out in the political realm, potentially causing a program of good against evil. Building on the Judeo-Christian ideas of good and evil, Peterson suggests that the spiritual battle between the two should be dealt individually, not projecting one's perceived malevolence onto external entities. This, he proposes, will prevent one from becoming a self-righteous persecutor in the political realm. Greenwald resonates with Peterson's views, providing insights into his own spiritual journey. He reveals how politics has, over time, become a vehicle for the expression of people's unconducted religious dimensions. Talking about the danger of fanaticism and righteousness within this context, he further highlights the potential hazards if these elements are ported into politics. Douglas points out the conversation navigates through the idea of humanist endeavors and their necessity to be embedded in an underlying religious framework. Peterson refers to psychoanalyst Carl Jung's perception that human rationality is bounded by dreams, a mediator between known and unknown. This suggests that the boundaries lie within transcendent characters of dreamscape, essentially as deities and religious figures. Finally, Greenwald reflects on the challenge of creating a sense of morality in a purely materialistic existence, noting his own shift towards embracing spirituality as essential in developing a solid ethical foundation and sense of empathy. He furthermore expounds on the risk of nihilism, as people are left without purpose or higher meaning when lacking a spiritual dimension. This reflects a broader societal issue that becomes more prevalent with the decline in religious beliefs. In the podcast, Dr. Peterson ventures deep into the crux of personal faith, discussing how various biblical stories convey a transcendent voice, calling individuals to embark on unique adventures, resist tyranny, and break from slavish habits. He argues that it is a decision of faith, a conscious choice based on personal belief, to heed or ignore such a voice and its calls to action. Coming from a different angle, Greenwald remarks on the humanity's millennial quest for purpose and meaning and how it reflects a fundamental spiritual craving common across cultures and religious divisions. Peterson addresses the inherent faith in our belief or disbelief in a supernatural force, underlining the concept that the absence of proof does not conclusively debunk the existence of such a force. Greenwald shares his previous overemphasis on external success and how his growing understanding of the importance of family and spirituality made him reconsider his place in the world. He corroborates Peterson's argument for the detrimental effects of the absence of a metaphysics, highlighting his personal find that the more he chased material success, the less fulfilled he felt. Further, Greenwald shares his shift towards spirituality, revealing how reading texts derived from Hinduism and adopting children greatly changed his perspective. He argues that one cannot be a complete person without a strong familial foundation and spiritual understanding, a view that aligns with Peterson's belief in humanity's inherent longing for a deeper purpose and meaning. The dialogue then switches to focus on Greenwald's early work, particularly a book he authored that criticized Republican politics hypocrisy. He admits a certain amount of chagrin over the book's partisan nature, asserting that the critiques he leveled, while rooted in truth, were framed and presented in a biased and one-sided manner. Comparing it to his work since, Greenwald acknowledges the editorial push for something more sensational at the time, pulling his journalistic beliefs into sharp relief. In the continued podcast discussion, Glenn Greenwald dives into his book that criticized the hypocrisy of the Republican Party. Despite agreeing with the critiques in his book, he confesses feeling disappointed with the partisan bias in his representation. By his account, the pressure to deliver a commercially successful book played a significant role in skewing the balance of his analysis. Comparing his earlier work with his recent output, he acknowledges a shift in his journalistic beliefs, gravitating more towards an unbiased, thorough examination of issues rather than sensational takes. Next, the discussion shifts to Greenwald's book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, where he analyzes how law is strategically used to protect the powerful and sustain inequality in society. He especially criticizes the practice of one administration forgiving the wrongdoings of the previous ones and the selective omission of legal proceedings for people involved in the 2008 financial scandal. Greenwald's sentiment is that the legal and economic structures in society are disproportionately weighed in the favor of those in power, perpetuating the socio-economic division between the elites and the masses. He observes a worrying trend among the elites who, instead of trying to appease the dissenting public, are beginning to lean towards authoritarian means to control unrest. This, according to him, denotes a society marching towards militarianism, with elites using law as a weapon against the powerless demographics. Delving into his 2014 book, No Place to Hide, Greenwald reveals how his work with Edward Snowden exposed the level of surreptitious surveillance that the U.S. government was conducting on its citizens, much of which was unknown to the public. This moment was, by his own account, a radicalizing experience which highlighted the unchecked power wielded by the U.S. security state. His concerns extend not only to violations of privacy, but to the profound lack of democratic accountability and transparency in the operation of such programs. The dialogue then gravitates towards a recurrent question among critics: has Western society progressed further down this authoritarian path since the time Greenwald wrote the book? Greenwald suggests that the reality appears to be a worrisome move towards increased governmental control and decreased democratic accountability. In the ongoing podcast discussion, Glenn Greenwald characterizes the contemporary tensions in Western society as an alarming interplay between power dynamics and evolving cultural narratives. Focusing in particular on the controversies surrounding WikiLeaks and the Snowden revelations, Glenn reveals his belief that the government's version of events and legal decisions tend to serve the powerful and sustain inequality. He condemns the tendency of one administration to absolve the wrongdoings of its predecessor, citing this as a particularly insidious manifestation of elite protection. Greenwald observes an unnerving trend where, rather than addressing the concerns of a dissenting public, those in power increasingly lean towards authoritarian means to quell disturbances. This, he argues, denotes a shift towards a more militaristic society where law is employed as a weapon against the less powerful demographics. A significant part of the discussion is dedicated to Greenwald's 2014 book, No Place to Hide. He recounts working alongside whistleblower Edward Snowden to expose the level of surveillance that the U.S. government conducted on its own citizens, much of which was previously unknown to the public. This experience, Greenwald shares, marked a turning point in his understanding of the unchecked power held by the U.S. security state. His concerns extend beyond violations of privacy and touch on the dramatic lack of democratic accountability and transparency associated with such clandestine operations. Greenwald suggests Western society is witnessing an alarming move towards increased governmental control and decreased democratic accountability. He perceives a marked shift in societal priority and increased division and extremism. Greenwald also discusses the polarization in contemporary American politics, particularly focusing on the intersectionality of political and cultural ideologies. He criticizes the left for its monomaniacal fixation on identity politics, suggesting that such focus distracts from more pressing issues such as corporate tyranny, economic disparity, and foreign policy. Greenwald criticizes the tendency of self-proclaimed culture warriors on the left for becoming increasingly overbearing and morally rigid, often resorting to cancel culture. He points out that such factions prioritize cultural wars over addressing imperialism, corporatism, and socioeconomic disparities, resulting in the loss of cohesive dialogue and thoughtful discussions. Towards the end of this segment of the conversation, Greenwald identifies the striking paradox in contemporary political narratives. Despite presenting itself as a rebel against capitalist authority, the left often has significant corporations on its side, serving as enforcers of its ideologies. Greenwald also mentions a certain hypocrisy within organs of state power like the CIA or the FBI, which co-opt liberal cultural symbols and narratives, thereby garnering acceptance from the left despite their fundamentally authoritarian nature. This part of the podcast thus explores the complex alliance between corporate power, government agencies, and radical left ideologies in shaping today's political discourse and policy. As the discussion in the podcast continues, Peterson and Greenwald delve into the complex dynamics of power structures, camouflaged under the guise of compassion and corporate alliances. A theme surfaces around exploiting public empathy to cover malevolent tendencies, particularly seen in corporate entities aligning with entities perceived as compassionate. Greenwald indicates that entities showing a facade of compassion could serve as the best camouflage for dark triad individuals of the narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic personality traits, who are strategic, self-interested promoters hiding behind the veil of compassion. This observation extends to corporations that align themselves with the ideologies of the compassionate left, using displays of empathy to amass power. Greenwald terms these entities as useful idiots within the left, individuals naive enough to equate any show of compassion with genuine empathy. In Peterson and Greenwald's view, this manipulative strategy allows power structures, both corporate and governmental, to quietly amass power while maintaining an appearance of compassion. This, they believe, is behind the seemingly odd alliance between the left, historically a voice for the dispossessed, and the contemporary, gargantuan forces of government, media, and corporations. Further adding to this narrative, Greenwald notes that identity politics is deployed in a similar fashion to social justice causes. They're employed by powerful institutions to throw weight behind their faux liberalism, further cementing their kinship with the left. By making superficial demographic changes within their ranks, these institutions project an illusion of radical change. This clever guise of diversity allows them to expand their support base while continuing detrimental practices under the radar, thereby shaping the new political landscape. Peterson and Greenwald suggest the current socio-political discourse baffles traditional understanding of right-left dynamics and requires fresh conceptualizations. This innovative landscape leaves many confused about their own ideological leanings, as traditional political targets might now appear allied with contrasting ideologies. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.